I hold the view that the separation between church and state is absolute, and I think
Mm,
conservatives and Republicans should start owning the Establishment Clause like they own the Second Amendment and
sure.
own their stances on constitutionalism. I think if they started to understand that you can reach a Christian demographic, get Christians and people of faith to vote for you, and still be pro church state separation. You take that power away from the Democratic Party, you take that power away from the left in that regards. It would be such a win-win for Republicans, but that's, I guess, something that is still unfortunately seen as blue or team blue or liberal
Mm,
to have when I don't think it should be partisan at all. I'm pro gay marriage, but a lot of Republicans are since the 2015
yeah.
ruling. There are still some individuals that might not like it, but I know the party, on the most part, has gotten past that debate. I've always been pro same sex marriage, at least from a government standpoint, not like forcing churches to perform same sex weddings or things like that. So a lot of LGBT issues and secular atheist related issues, I guess that would be seen, those positions would be seen as some of my most left wing positions.
Yeah.
But on a lot of other issues, I'm to the right.
Yeah, so I was gonna wait to get into the philosophy, but I am gonna ask you a couple of follow-up questions. Here's one. One of the things regarding the church and state separation is, by the way, I agree. Actually, I don't think that the church and state should be integrated in any way. There's Catholic integralists that are flirting with that idea, and I've done some reading, and it's interesting, but probably not a good idea. But would you argue that I would argue pretty strenuously that the separation between church and state is not the same thing between separation between governance and religion. Many of the founders talked about how like this our government does not work without a moral religious people. We have in God we
Mhm.
trust on the dollar signs. Fundamentally, the government makes moral assumptions all the time, many of them Christian. So, would you agree with that distinction between church and state versus governance and religion? I'm just kind of want to throw that idea your way and see how you react.
I would say yes and no. So when
Oh,
it comes
fantastic.
to the technical term, you're actually very much correct.
Yeah,
I'll play devil's advocate against myself for a little bit.
excellent.
There are when the United States was founded, while we have a secular government, and while I would argue a good chunk of the founding fathers wanted to make sure that religion was separate from government, um, each state at the time had their own state religion.
Mhm.
And that stopped becoming a factor around the time of the Civil War. After the Civil War, once we passed the 14th Amendment, it basically guaranteed every bit of the federal rights of the First Amendment to apply to all the states on the state level. So
Yeah.
that's when this whole idea of, well, my state is Catholic, my state is Baptist, blah blah blah. That's when that really stopped being enforced, and I think it should have stopped being enforced the moment the Constitution was put into place. So yes and no. I think we we have a separation of church and state that was originally put on the books to kind of imply that, and it took a few decades to really work through the nuts and bolts of it. But now, when I mean separation of church and state, or when any church state activist means separation of church and state, they mean separation from religion and government as well. And there are certain things that we could probably go into, like God, in God we trust on the money, under God in the
Mhm.
Pledge of Allegiance, and go through them bit by bit. But I would actually argue some of that isn't even stuff that should be constitutionally allowed or protected. Not that it's the most popular thing to say,
Yeah.
but I think if constitutionalists, especially on the right, started to own that philosophy, you take a lot of power away from your opposition
Well, I think that's
by
certainly
having
true.
that definition of church-state separation.
Well, I think that's true. I mean, I think you would get rid of the attack angle that like the right is all crazy evangelicals. The unfortunate part is that a lot of the GOP base are indeed crazy evangelicals and do want to be. And I say that in the most affectionate, loving way I possibly can. Nobody loves the evangelicals more than me. This has been polled, and it's scientifically proven that I love them the most. But I would agree that it takes away an angle of attack. The only thing I would say is that the left would probably find something else pretty easily. Um, and then the other thing I'd pose to you, maybe not as a question, but just as maybe a little bit of pushback, is that I think there's actually like a pretty good debate. Like I'm a pretty big constitutional originalist. It seems like the founders are pretty divided on this. Washington, Adams, Hamilton, Madison would all probably be fine with a little bit more religion in government than at least what we have right now. While I agree that people more like Jefferson and people on those side of the camp might be in your camp. So I think that the founders were pretty divided on this. So I wouldn't say that it's super cut and dry on the most originalist way to interpret the Constitution. I would argue that if you just look at the time period, it was more religious then. Obviously, the Constitution wasn't being actively violated when it was first enforced. At least one would hope not. But I would say that I think there's like a debate there. But I would definitely
Very
agree on.
much so, and there's so many contradictions
Yeah,
even within the founding fathers, I got to admit.
yeah,
Like,
exactly.
you have John Adams, who's our most religious founding father
Yeah,
out of all of them, who's made, I believe he was the one who made that comment about a virtuous and religious
yep.
people.
I mean,
Yet
multiple founders did something
simultaneously,
similar.
you got
But
the
yeah,
Treaty of Tripoli, with him saying in 1799 that the government of the United States is not in any way founded on the Christian religion.
who
So
said
it's
that?
super weird. He said that in 1799 when we were fighting the
Adams?
Barbary pirates. Um,
Yeah. They were politicians at the end of the day. You do have to remember, as much as
yep.
we do like them. Yeah, no, it's I would say that the historical record is definitely contradictory to some extent, for sure.